evening. I'm Sergeant Wayne Jenkins of Gun Trace Task Force. I'm assigned to Baltimore City Police Department.
Crime often demands harsh consequences, but some sentences are so extreme they leave you stunned. From kidnappers who prey on the innocent to mass murderers and even rogue officers, these outcomes push the limits of justice. Get ready, because what comes next might be the harshest punishment you've ever witnessed.
I told her that if she said anything, that I would do something to her parents. And if I was in jail, I would have my friends to do it.
Michael Webb. In May 2019, an ordinary evening walk in Fort Worth, Texas, twisted into a nightmare. A mother and her 8-year-old daughter were strolling through their neighborhood, enjoying the warm night air when a car pulled up and abruptly stopped. Without warning, Michael Webb reached out, seized the little girl, and yanked her into the vehicle. The mother, screaming and clawing at the car, fought desperately to save her child, but Webb sped away, leaving the stunned woman behind, her pleas for help echoing through the quiet street. The community's sense of security shattered instantly, and everyone feared the worst.
Help me! Help me, please! My daughter just got kidnapped!
Surveillance video captured the moment Salem was taken Saturday evening. Police say her mother jumped into the suspect's car, frantically trying to save her.
The kidnapping triggered a relentless search effort. Phones buzzed with Amber Alerts. Neighbors gathered to distribute flyers, and police officers fanned out across Fort Worth, determined to bring the child home. Hours turned into a tense race against time. At first, every lead hit a dead end. Then, a crucial tip directed investigators to a nondescript motel. Inside one of its cramped rooms, Webb believed he had outwitted them. He tucked the terrified girl into a small laundry basket and warned her to keep silent. When officers knocked the first time, they saw nothing out of place and left empty-handed, a grim frustration hanging over their efforts. But a few hours later, they returned with force. They broke down the door and searched every corner. Lifting a pile of clothes, an officer found her, alive, shaking, yet incredibly brave. Outside, the mother collapsed in tears when she heard her daughter's voice. The entire scene, captured by police body cam footage, showed officers rushing the child to safety.
Yes. Hey, buddy.
With the victim safe and Webb behind bars, the case surged through the courts. Evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage linked Webb's car to the abduction, and his confession to investigators sealed his fate. Prosecutors emphasized the cruelty of the act, ripping a child away from her mother's side on a peaceful evening stroll, and the unimaginable terror the girl endured. The defense had little ground to stand on. In the jury's eyes, there was no ambiguity, no doubt. Guilty. The judge then handed down a sentence that matched the severity of the crime: life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was a punishment that left no room for leniency, one that reflected society's absolute intolerance for crimes against children. On the day of sentencing, the family wept softly in the courtroom. Though their wounds would take time to heal, they knew Webb would never again threaten another child's safety. The community, still scarred by the event, found a measure of closure in the harsh sentence. This was not just justice served, it was justice roaring back with uncompromising force.
The man accused of kidnapping 13-year-old Jamie Kloss after killing her parents in their barren home had his preliminary hearing this morning.
Jake Patterson. In October 2018, the stillness of rural Wisconsin was shattered with unspeakable violence. 13-year-old Jamie Kloss awoke to the sound of her dog barking, and moments later, a stranger, Jake Patterson, pounded on the family's front door. He had planned every detail so meticulously that he left not a single strand of hair or drop of DNA behind. Patterson burst inside, shot Jamie's father, and then marched through the house, finding her mother in a bathroom, shielding Jamie with her own body. What happened next forever scarred a quiet American town. He murdered Jamie's mother right before the teenager's eyes, then ripped the trembling girl from everything she knew and forced her into his waiting car. It was all over in minutes. A carefully rehearsed nightmare had come horrifyingly true. For the next 88 days, Jamie lived in pure terror. Patterson held her captive under a bed in a cramped, remote cabin deep in the Wisconsin woods. He threatened her constantly, warning her not to cry out or attempt any escape. Weeks turned into months, and outside that darkened room, an entire nation searched desperately. Posters plastered highway rest stops and small-town diners. News anchors repeated her name night after night. a prayer for her safe return. Meanwhile, Jamie counted heartbeats and tried not to lose hope. In early January 2019, fate finally offered her a door to freedom. Patterson decided he needed a new job and left the cabin to apply. This one lapse, leaving her alone, was all Jamie needed. Barefoot, half frozen by the frigid Wisconsin winter, she ran into the cold air, pushing forward despite fear and pain. She encountered a woman walking a dog. That neighbor recognized Jamie immediately from the widely circulated photographs. Within minutes, the police swarmed in, and Patterson, returning to find his prisoner gone, was arrested not far from the very spot he had once felt so confident no one would ever find him.
Case involving the 14-year-old girl, referring to Jamie Kloss, who Patterson was convicted of kidnapping the same day he murdered her parents.
In the courtroom, Patterson broke down. He pleaded guilty and offered tears and vague remorse, but no explanation could justify the horror he unleashed. The prosecutors read a statement from Jamie, who chose not to face him directly. Her words cut through the silence. This man stole her innocence, shattered her family, and made the world feel unsafe in a way she could never have imagined. Sitting stoically, the judge considered the staggering brutality of Patterson's crimes and the nightmare Jamie endured. The sentence left no doubt. 2 life terms, ensuring he would never walk free again, plus additional decades for good measure. Patterson would spend his life in prison without a single glimpse of ordinary freedom. This was not just a punishment. It was a declaration that no mercy would be shown to a man who had hunted a childlike prey.
Before I did this, I planned on taking multiple girls, killing multiple families. I wanted to treat them differently, play mind games with them.
When the gavel finally dropped, the community exhaled, wounded but relieved. Jamie had survived against all odds. Her courage, resilience, and daring escape became symbols of hope in a story that, for too long, had been defined by violence. Patterson's life sentence wasn't just retribution, it was a warning to anyone who might believe they could steal a child from her home and rewrite her fate. The entire nation, which had followed the case with a collective, trembling heart, now saw justice done. Jamie would have a chance to heal, supported by a community that had never given up on her. In that healing process, there was a lesson for everyone. Even in the darkest corners, the human spirit can endure. And when evil tries to slip away, the legal system can roar back with a sentence so severe, it leaves no room for doubt. Patterson's life behind bars would serve as a reminder that preying on the vulnerable invites the harshest reckoning imaginable.
Why did you do it?
The sister of the 21-year-old church massacre madman was supposed to get married this weekend.
Dylann Roof. On the evening of June 17, 2015, Dylann Roof walked into Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and joined a Bible study group. For nearly an hour, he sat with the group, pretending to participate in the session. Then, in an act of unthinkable violence, he pulled out a .45 caliber Glock pistol and opened fire on the group, killing 9 parishioners, including the church's pastor, Clementa Pinckney. Roof's motives were explicitly rooted in white supremacist ideology. A chilling manifesto found later detailed his desire to incite a race war. The massacre sent shockwaves through the nation, highlighting the lingering scars of racism in America. Survivors and families were left devastated, with the church community and the entire country grappling with the horror of the attack. Within hours of the shooting, Roof was identified as the suspect, thanks to surveillance footage and witness descriptions. A manhunt ensued, and he was apprehended the next morning during a traffic stop in Shelby, North Carolina. Roof confessed to the shooting during an interrogation, showing no remorse and openly discussing his intentions. The brazen admission further fueled outrage and grief.
Do you know where they're possibly at now?
They just passed Carter Chevrolet going towards, the home.
Let me tell my officers right quick.
I know it's tough sometimes to...
Roof's trial began in 2016 and was marked by highly emotional testimonies. Survivors, including Polly Shepard, who had been spared by Roof to tell the world what happened, recounted the harrowing events of that evening. Families of the victims gave heart-wrenching statements about their loss. Some expressed their grief through forgiveness, while others demanded justice with raw, searing anger. In a shocking decision, Roof chose to represent himself during the sentencing phase, refusing legal counsel. This led to awkward and unsettling moments in court, where he showed no remorse, reiterating his belief in his actions. He delivered chilling, emotionless statements, further alienating himself from even the slightest sympathy. Courtroom reactions were deeply emotional, as family members recounted their losses and expressed their grief. A particularly notable moment occurred when Nadine Collier, daughter of victim Ethel Lance, addressed Roof directly, stating, "I forgive you. You took something very precious from me. I will never talk to her again, but I forgive you."
And that we will be okay. She's in a better place now, that we all trying to get there.
After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before finding Roof guilty on all 33 federal charges, including hate crimes, murder, and obstruction of religious freedom. The sentencing phase began soon after, with the prosecution arguing for the death penalty. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to portray Roof as a troubled young man driven by delusions, though this argument failed to gain traction. In January 2017, the jury unanimously sentenced Dylann Roof to death. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Families of the victims embraced each other, some crying tears of relief, while Roof sat emotionless, his face a blank slate, seemingly unfazed by the decision.
Dylann Roof, the suspect in the shooting spree at a South Carolina church that claimed 9 lives, was charged with 9 counts of murder on Friday.
Roof's case marked the first time in U.S. history that a person was sentenced to death for federal hate crimes. While some viewed the death sentence as a fitting punishment for his heinous act, others criticized it as inconsistent with the forgiveness many victims' families had offered. The case reignited debates over the death penalty, racism, and gun control in America. The Charleston church shooting remains a painful reminder of the consequences of unchecked hate and racism. Roof's sentence sent a strong message that such acts of violence would face the harshest possible punishment, but it also left scars on a community and a nation still struggling to heal.
This after video footage of a former sheriff's deputy allegedly planting evidence was released. As we told you last week, Zach Wester has been fired.
Zachary Wester. For a time, Deputy Zachary Wester of Florida's Jackson County Sheriff's Office was celebrated as a fearless officer who kept drugs off the streets. Arrest after arrest, he hauled supposed traffickers and users to jail, building a reputation as a staunch enforcer of the law. But then the cracks began to show. People he stopped swore they were clean, insisting they had never touched drugs. They demanded to know why baggies of narcotics magically appeared in their cars after Wester pulled them over. Their pleas sounded like desperate lies, until body cam footage revealed something chilling. Wester was seen holding suspicious baggies before discovering them on his stops. Suddenly, the hero cop looked more like a puppet master, planting evidence to create crimes where none existed. As whispers grew into open accusations, Internal Affairs launched a probe. They searched Wester's patrol car trunk and found a stash of illegal drugs, ready-made props for his next roadside bust. One by one, the pieces fell into place. People who had been arrested lost their jobs, their children, and their reputations. Some even served time, all based on fabricated charges. The outrage was immediate and intense. Prosecutors had no choice but to drop more than 100 cases connected to Wester, admitting they could no longer trust the evidence he presented. Those wrongfully accused demanded their records be cleared and their lives restored. This was no mere misconduct. This was a deliberate violation of public trust.
This is a case about an abuse of an incredible power. The defendant used his position as a deputy sheriff to make traffic stops on 12 members of this community and plant methamphetamine in their cars.
In court, the victims took the stand and described what Wester had stolen from them: livelihoods, custody of their children, and their good names. The defense tried to salvage Wester's image, painting him as a dedicated public servant who went astray. But surveillance videos and his hidden stash of contraband told a darker story. Jurors didn't flinch. They convicted Wester on multiple counts of official misconduct and other charges. He had betrayed the very people he had sworn to protect. When the sentencing day arrived, the judge left no room for sympathy. 12 years in prison for an officer who had weaponized his badge against the innocent. And then came a measure of restitution, a $1 million settlement for his victims, a sum that acknowledged the immense harm they had suffered. In that courtroom, a message rang loud and clear. Corruption under the color of law would be met with severe, unforgiving consequences.
Mr. Williams, I've explained this to you 3 or 4 times now as far as why that is not on the video.
In the wake of Wester's conviction, Jackson County residents wrestled with anger and a renewed skepticism toward law enforcement. The revelation shook their faith, reminding everyone that a uniform does not guarantee integrity. In response, the sheriff's office promised reforms, better training, more oversight, and accountability systems to prevent another Wester from exploiting the badge. Public meetings are filled with heated questions and demands for transparency. While no amount of sentencing or compensation could fully restore what had been taken from the victims, seeing the ex-deputy behind bars offered some solace. Wayne Jenkins. Baltimore had hoped its elite gun trace task force would bring order to streets flooded with illegal firearms. Instead, this special unit became a criminal enterprise wearing badges. Under the command of Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, these officers weren't just cutting corners, they were openly violating the very laws they'd sworn to uphold. They stole cash from drug dealers and innocent citizens alike, planted narcotics as evidence to secure convictions, and penned falsified reports to hide their crimes. Their methods went beyond corruption. They resembled tactics employed by organized crime rings, all while wearing the uniform of public servants. The recklessness of Jenkins and his crew knew few limits. They brazenly robbed suspects at gunpoint, shaking them down under the cover of official police work. During one high-speed chase, their pursuit led to the death of an innocent bystander, a fatal reminder that their actions weren't victimless. It was only a matter of time before honest officers and federal investigators pierced through the blue wall of silence. Whistleblowers came forward and the FBI dug deep, unmasking a level of corruption that stunned even seasoned agents. The scale of deception, tens of thousands of dollars stolen, countless drugs resold on the streets, and sham reports filed was nearly impossible to fathom.
There's Detective Graham. He pulled out the handgun and the cocaine. Go ahead, send him in the car, just to clear the line.
Officers, not white shirts, in police reports because you don't want to inconvenience them.
Cornered by overwhelming evidence, Wayne Jenkins pleaded guilty. In court, he tried to show remorse, breaking down as he confessed to betraying the trust of his community. But the gravity of his crimes was immense. The judge delivered a stern sentence, 25 years in federal prison. Other members of the task force also found themselves stripped of their badges and locked behind bars. The city, already grappling with distrust and tension between law enforcement and citizens, felt its wounds deepen. Every headline and every detail of the trial reminded residents how a group of officers had twisted their authority into a weapon of greed and fear. The aftermath forced Baltimore to confront uncomfortable truths. People who had been wrongfully arrested or had money stolen by these rogue officers won multi-million-dollar settlements, yet no amount of compensation could fully repair the damage. Parents had to explain to children that not every officer is a hero, and neighborhoods once open to community policing initiatives recoiled in suspicion. Local officials promised reforms, more oversight, stricter accountability measures, body cameras, but the road to restoring faith would be long and uphill. Elsewhere in the country, law enforcement agencies watched with a mix of horror and resolve. This scandal exposed how a few bad officers, if left unchecked, could erode public trust, undermine legitimate crime-fighting efforts, and turn courts into theaters of injustice. The lesson was clear. Even those with badges, guns, and power must face consequences if they abandon their oaths for personal gain. Hunter Elward. In January 2023, 6 Mississippi law enforcement officers, infamously nicknamed the Goon Squad, violated the sanctity of a home in ways that defy belief. They stormed into a residence without a warrant, confronting 2 black men who had been doing nothing more than living their lives. What followed was not just an arrest or a misguided search, it was an extended ritual of cruelty. The officers hurled racial slurs, beat their victims relentlessly, subjected them to sexual humiliation, and even threatened to kill them. At one point, they poured cooking oil, syrup, and eggs over the men, laughing as if torment were a sport. To cover their tracks, the officers snatched up the home's security footage, tossing it into a river. Yet, darkness does not protect those who commit atrocities under the badge.
Can you imagine the abject terror those two victims must have felt?
The victims testified that the officers treated them like less than human, shocking them with tasers while mocking their pain. Guns were pointed at heads, threats were made, and the perpetrators seemed to revel in the agony they inflicted. Over time, their walls of denial crumbled. Confronted by the severity of their crimes and the mounting evidence, these so-called protectors pleaded guilty to an array of federal civil rights violations and related offenses: obstruction, assault, and conspiracy. Their uniform status could not mask the truth that they had become violent criminals in every sense of the word.
You understand the court's not bound by any plea bargain agreement to impose the maximum sentence here. You also understand that I accept your plea.
The victims faced their tormentors in court, speaking about the ordeal that had ripped apart their sense of safety and dignity. Meanwhile, the officers, men who once wore badges, stood teary-eyed and trembling, awaiting their fate. The judge did not hesitate. Sentences ranged from 10 to 40 years, ensuring that these men would spend a significant portion of their lives behind bars. Families of the victims left the courtroom with complex emotions. There was relief that justice had been done, but the scars, both physical and psychological, would never fade. This was not merely a verdict against a few rogue officers. It was a thunderous declaration that the justice system refuses to tolerate heinous acts committed under the guise of law enforcement.
Sentencing for the former Mississippi law enforcement officers who tortured and abused two black men. They will spend years behind bars. Faith Abubi has the story. Good morning, Faith.
The revelations unleashed a wave of outrage and debate. Jesse Elbais shining a harsh spotlight on systemic issues of racism and abuse of power. The community demanded answers and reforms, forcing an introspection into the nature of policing and the safeguards meant to prevent such horrors. Local leaders and national figures weighed in, insisting this case stand as a marker. The message was brutally clear: a badge is no shield against prosecution. The victims, though forever changed, found some measure of closure in knowing their attackers would never again wear a uniform or wield unchecked authority. Across the country, law enforcement agencies took note. Training, supervision, and accountability measures faced renewed scrutiny. The Goon Squad name would go down in infamy, a reminder that no matter how deep the corruption or cruelty, there is a line that cannot be crossed without dire consequences. In the end, this trial and sentencing proved that even the strongest blue walls crumble before undeniable truth, and that courts will strip away the uniform to reveal the criminal underneath. Such brutality would not go unanswered, and the legal system had the final, unmistakable word. From child abductors and domestic terrorists to corrupt cops and brutal torturers, these cases show that justice can wield unforgiving strength. Each sentence, whether countless life terms or decades behind bars, becomes a warning to anyone who inflicts unimaginable harm. If you enjoyed these cases, then make sure to watch our next ones shown on screen.